The technical challenges there. Welcome to my session on configuration management across environments. I'm Scott Weston. I am a principal Drupal architect at Bounteous, and I've been working with Drupal since 2007, so been around the block a few times in the Drupal space. As I mentioned a moment ago, I work at Bounteous, and Drupal is just one piece of what we do. We're kind of the big picture digital solutions company that enables digital transformations for some of the leading brands in the world. So if you're interested in talking more about that, see me after the session. We definitely can give you some examples of work that we've done. So the reason for the session is to solve this problem. And if any of you have been doing Drupal 8 with configuration management, you've probably run into this, is how can you have different configurations on different environments? So it could be your local, it could be dev, staging, and production. Have different configurations that just work and maintain your sanity. So hopefully, as we go through this today, I can kind of share my approach to this, and we can maybe transfer some sanity to your lives here. Kind of how we're going to walk through this is we're going to talk about a very contrived scenario just to highlight what you can do with different configurations and different environments. I'm going to talk about the tools that I use to solve this problem, and then we're going to talk about the config miso. That's kind of the solution we're going to be using, and then if time allows, we'll actually walk through a really quick example of how to set some of this up. So the scenario. So let's say that we're building a site, and we have dev, staging, and production environments. And we want some different things to happen on different environments, depending on which environment it is. So a couple of examples that we have here is like the Devel module. We want the Devel module enabled on the dev environment in our locals, but we don't want it enabled, let's say, on staging or in production because of the performance hit and that sort of thing. Caching on dev, we want it turned off. And on our local turned off. That way we're not having to flush caches every time we make a change. And then for errors, let's say on local and dev, let's output every error to the screen. That way QA is really aware if there's something that's not quite right with what we built. And then in staging, just only show the warnings, and in production, turn all those errors off. And we have a few other examples here that we can talk through. A tip that I have is I generally make a spreadsheet, just a Google spreadsheet that has kind of this layout to it. That way I can just have it almost like a checklist of how I'm going to configure the differences in these environments. So what do we use to kind of implement this approach? First, we're definitely going to use core config management. And then some contributed modules come into the mix that are really helpful. The first is configuration ignore. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these a little later. And then configuration split. Config split does require the config filter module, so that will come along for the ride when you add it to your site. Some recommended things, the chosen library and module that make select boxes like sane. There are a lot of options in the config split configuration forms, and chosen module makes life a lot easier there. And then there's also kind of another module that we've used is the web form config ignore. Let me see here. So the configuration ignore module, what its job is on configuration import. If a configuration is listed in the configuration ignore, it just gets jettisoned out and not imported into the site at all. So an example of that would be, let's say that you're using lots of blocks on the site as content, and you don't want block instances to have to go through code changes in configuration management to get imported on the site. So if you add like block.block star to configuration ignore, your blocks now just live in the environment in which they're on. They don't get overwritten or reverted on configuration import. They just kind of live there, which is awesome. And then The web form config ignore module, it kind of does the same thing, but it's very specific to web forms, and it has a little bonus to it. So let's say that you're developing a web form, and you do it on your local, and you do a config export, commit the code, it gets moved to dev, to staging, and to production. Web form config ignore will only do the first import of that form, so like the initial import, and then after that it lives on its own. That way you don't have to rebuild the form in each environment, but then your content managers or site administrators can make changes to that form as time goes on and the needs change. And that doesn't have to go back to a developer for a code change in order to implement that in multiple environments. So one of the first things that we need to do once we get the modules installed is we need Drupal to know what environment it is currently working on. Bounteous is a partner of Acquia, and so we use Acquia hosting for most of our Drupal sites. And Acquia has an environment variable called site environment, and it's going to be dev, test, or prod, depending on what environment the site is running on. So we can leverage into that. We can use a switch statement to make some differences depending on what environment we're in. Pantheon uses Pantheon _ environment. I think Platform uses, I think it's env, just an environment variable called env, I think. But if you're using someone else for hosting, just check with their documentation, or if you're self-hosting, build whatever works for you for that. So then, those are kind of like the tools, and then this is the kind of the implementation. I have this lovely acronym called MISO, just like the lovely soup. And these are the 4 kind of facets to getting your environments with different configuration. The first is core configuration management. Next is config ignore. Then we have config splits. And then we have config overrides, and we're going to walk through each of these. So, core configuration management, that's the traditional thing that everyone's used to, using Drush or using the configuration management form of importing and exporting configuration, committing it to code, moving it around through the different environments. Next is config ignore, which I mentioned a little bit ago, and that's using the config ignore module. And again, what that does is when configuration is being imported, it's compared against this list that you've defined of things to ignore, and if it matches that, it's not imported. That change is not impacted into the site. One of the things that might sound scary about using config ignore is when you do a config export, the items in your ignore list still get exported to code. And so you can commit them, you can choose not to commit them, but the assurance is when you import that code, that configuration, if it's in the ignore list, it's not going to get imported. So first time you do it, you might think something is wrong because you told it to ignore basic site settings or error messaging or something like that, and you see it exported and you think, oh, something's not right. It's on the import is when config ignore really comes into play. And you can get very specific or use wildcards in there, and I'll show some examples of that in a moment. And the helpful tip here is never ignore config ignore or core extension configuration. So core extension is the configuration file that tells Drupal what modules are enabled and in what order of priority that they should fire. And config ignore is the settings for config ignore. So never ignore config ignore because that's a recipe for disaster. So some examples here. If you use blocks for content a lot, you might want to put block.block.star in your config ignore. That way blocks just live on their own. They become almost Drupal 7-y in that they don't get changed during configuration import. If you're using the robots text module, you might want to drop robot text.settings in there so that you could have different settings on dev and stage and production. And then you can get very, very specific, like in the body copy of the password reset email. You can just ignore that, and everything else on that basic site settings page still lives there. So you can get, again, very specific with these if you like. The next is configuration split, and that's using the configuration split module. And this is where if you want to have differences between environments, this is really where that piece of this comes into play. The config split are stored. The configuration for configuration split is stored as YAML files that just get exported into your main sync directory. And there is a drush command to do the config split exports. You have to do, this adds one step where you do the config split export as well as your main config export. And that's because of the config filter. It'll take care of putting the split configs in a different directory. And actually, we'll walk through that in the demo that we're going to have here in a few minutes. And then a split can either be active or inactive. And when it's active, that means on config import, what is in that configuration split is brought into that site. So think of the staging site. You have your staging split active, and that means that when you do a configuration import, everything's grabbed out of that staging directory, the configuration from there, and it's imported into the site. And then again, leverage those environment variables to activate or inactivate specific splits per environment. And there are two kinds of splits that you can put in place. One is a complete split, and that means a module and all of its settings is either on or off, and then those settings are brought in. And then there's the conditional split, and that's more for like very specific settings. So that would be like on the production environment, I want no errors logged to the screen. On production, I want caching set to 30 days. So you can set those very conditionally for those environments. Because those aren't a module you can turn off and on. Those are just very specific settings that you can have different settings for depending on the environment. And then the last is the configuration overrides. This is the pretty traditional, I want what I have in my settings file to win over whatever the database and active configuration may say. And these would be used, that's kind of the last word of what a setting, a variable is set to. So some examples there. If we're on dev or staging, we might want the robot's text settings to just disallow everything, so that if a bot finds one of your lower environments, it's not getting indexed. If you have API keys or IDs which you don't want modified, you could put those as a config override. Here I give an example of like your Google Tag Manager container ID. There is a config form for it, but you really, it would be a very rare case where that would need to be changed in configuration. And then also like which configuration split should be active for a given environment. So in this example, the staging, if we're looking at the staging site, or we would want to have the status for configuration split for staging set to true. So now kind of walk through all that. Taking that spreadsheet that we looked at early on, I've put down here on the left side which part of the miso would apply to this, to each of these rows here. So to have the Devel module turned on in one environment but not in others, we would use a split. That would be a complete split. For caching with different settings, depending on environment, that would be a conditional split. Error reporting would be a conditional split. For the robots.txt module, it's going to be a combination of override for dev and stage, and then an ignore for production. That way, it is fully authorable by a content admin when they get an email from their SEO person that says, "Hey, you need to have this in your robots text file." That way, it doesn't have to go back for a code change to be implemented. A split for database logging, being on or off. Environment indicator, So this is just different colors for the toolbar, depending on what environment we're on. And then content blocks are just be ignored across the board, so that again they're handled as content. So when you go to actually set this up, these are the steps that I follow, and this is the sequence that I do. First is I configure my ignores, the things I don't want Drupal to import. Then I add kind of the detection switch in the settings file. Then I create the splits, and we'll walk through one of those in a moment. And then we create the directories that the split configuration will get stored in, and then you actually create the splits, export those, and then we'll do the overrides. So first is configuring the ignores. So when you enable config ignore in the configuration development section for synchronizing config, a new tab is added called ignore, and you just drop what you want to ignore in there. Easy way of determining what to put in there to ignore, as far as oh, I know I want X to be ignored, is look at the YAML file that is currently in the main sync directory, because it's basically just an array, and you put in the get as specific as you need to or want to with your array there, and you just put it in there. So that's what you do for config ignore. And then adding in that environment detection switch. Again, here over on the left, we're assuming it's an Acquia environment, and so it's if the environment is, if this variable is set my detected environment to that, so it'll be dev, stage, or prod, and then I have an else in here in case we're on our local or somewhere else, and we're just going to pump in that it's dev. Assuming it's our local, we'll want local config to match dev pretty closely. And then we have a switch statement, which just is a placeholder for when we want to insert those things into each environment. Then we're going to create the config split directories. One of the big things is it needs to be a sibling to your main sync directory. So by default, this is your sync directory, and then you create a sibling directory for each of the splits. I name them split underscore dev, split underscore stage, and then prod, just to make it very apparent which one it is. You do need to make the directories before creating the split, otherwise the config form for the split will get a little fussy with you. But it will make the htaccess file to prevent people from just navigating into that directory. So basically, just path to where the config directory is, and then a single make directory statement would make all three folders at once. And then we would actually create the splits. This may be a little overwhelming, but we'll walk through it, and I'll actually do this as part of the demo. We just make sure the current config is exported. What you do is you artificially set your computer to make it think for a few minutes that it's prod. Then you clear cache, and then do a config import to just make sure everything is up to date. And then you enable for the complete splits, you enable the modules you want turned on, make settings for those as you need, and then make any other config changes that you want for that environment. Then you go to the config, then you go to the split configuration form, you create that split, and then you run the drush command to actually do the export of the split. Then you do your main export, which I actually need an 8A in there as well. And then change your environment back to what it was in step one, and then do your import again, and you're back in business. You're up and running. Back to your local. So last step is to create the overrides, and so edit your settings PHP. For this example, you put in some different color values for the environment indicator. Tell Drupal which split you want turned on in each environment, and then have some overrides for the robots.txt that we have here in this example. All right, so we're actually going to hop to a demo and like any good cooking show that deals with miso, got some of this set up already. So we've got I'll zoom in here a little bit so it's easier to see. I got a clean Drupal site here set up, and in my code base here, show you what I have so far. I'm going to switch this into presenter mode, so hopefully everything is a little easier to see. So on this site, I do have that text, the code block, where we have the detection here, and since we're not on Acquia at the moment, it's going to be set to dev. And then here's our switch statement for right now. So for dev, I've got this lovely green color for the dev environment. Staging is kind of a orange or yellow, and then production is red. And then I have just a line for config for each of these to indicate I want split dev to be active on the dev environment. On staging, I want split stage active, and then production, I want split prod. So I kind of got all those pieces there, and what I'm going to do first is, if I can figure out how to use this in presenter mode, I'm going to, let's see here, let's set this to prod, and then I'm going to clear cache, and do a config import here. Oops. So it's doing a cache rebuild, and then it's going to import configuration it has. So, and essentially what it's done here is it has created a split for me because I didn't delete that as part of my demo. Okay, well, it'll be all right. So when we refresh the page here, Drupal thinks it's now prod, so we can see the environment indicator banner change from green to red. And so this is functioning, my local is thinking it is currently the production environment. So under configuration, admin section, let's go down here to config split settings, and I'm just going to delete this so I can recreate it for you guys. So pay no attention to that. So we're going to create a configuration split for production. And we need to do a few things just to make sure we're all ready here. First is in our example, we're going to turn on syslog for production, and we're going to change cache settings, and we're going to change the error messaging. So I'm going to enable, I can't type and talk at the same time, sorry about that. I'm going to enable syslog. And actually, it may already be enabled. Okay, yeah, we'll enable syslog here. So we've got that. And then we're going to make a few configuration changes to performance. We'll set that to, let's say, to a day for caching. And then over here, just making some other changes here, logging in errors. We want to make sure that's set to none. So we're good there. And then I'm going to hop back over here, and I am going to make a directory here for my split prod. So this is where those configuration changes I just made, when I export them specifically for production, that's where they're going to go. So got that. So we go back over here, and now we're going to create that configuration split. So again, in the configuration section, there's a link for configuration split settings. So we're going to add a new one. And this form is kind of big. It's not too scary if you know what's going on here. So we're going to name this, again, for the split that we want. So we're going to do split prod. And I've had a lot of typos today, so I'm just going to make sure I got that right. And then description, this will be my production splits here. And then for the folder, this is where we give it the directory that we want to export to. And it is relative to Drupal root, and in my example here, my config is on the same level as Drupal root. So I'll need to do / to get up a level, config, and then split prod. And there's a checkbox here for active that's checked by default. I always uncheck this box. That way I can rely solely on my settings file to tell me, or to tell Drupal if a split should be active or not. And then we have the complete split section. So this is the modules on and off. And I'm just going to put syslog in here. So I picked that. So syslog will be enabled and all the settings will get exported to a specific directory. And then down here are those conditional splits that we want different error logging, and we want different caching. So I'll just put in those. And cool thing about Chosen is instead of giving you a huge select box, you can actually start typing. So we'll do.
Will you put different passwords?
Like for API keys.
For SMTP settings, for instance.
Yeah. If there, sorry, what was the example you gave?
SMTP mailing. So is it
Oh,
mail on the dev?
yeah. You would put those probably as a conditional split. So you would find the name of the field that has that configuration in the settings form for your mailer, and then you would add it as a conditional split. You want everything else turned on in every environment. You just maybe want a different authentication password for those. Yeah. And then to go a little beyond that, we've have a few clients that are very protective about passwords in configuration. And what they do is, in addition to, I'm sure you've seen like the default settings looks for a settings.local.php. What they do is they actually create what a secrets file is what they call it. So it'd be like settings.secrets.php, and it's on the server itself, and it's not stored. Those passwords aren't stored in configuration, and they just live outside of the doc root, almost like in the home directory. And they include from that. So that's another way of doing it if you want to like not even surface passwords through your code management. So we're doing logging and performance here. So we're going to add those. And there's also a checkbox here. Let me see if I won't scroll up too far. It's split only when different. So what this does is if this box is checked and what you have said you're going to split already matches other environments, it's going to export it. I uncheck this box. That way I know for sure that my settings that I made here will always get exported to the right directory. So those are the two differences I make here. And if you have very specific settings that you want to override, you can also just add them in these text boxes as well if you want to do the advanced mode. All right, so we're going to save that. Since we already have that environment detection switch here, and I've already got a statement to turn that on for production, it says active overwritten because itself the checkbox is not active, but in settings we have it as active, so it will say overwritten. So we've got that, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a drush config split export CSEX. Sorry, it's at the bottom. You probably can't see it too well. And what's going to happen is it's going to ask me, are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. And so what's happened there is, if I did this right, the config directory that I made for production now has a couple of YAML files in it. And in here, these are those settings. For syslog, system logging, set to hide, and then performance, set the max age to a day, which is 86,400. So they're all there. And if we look a little further down here, see if I can split prod. That also output. This is the configuration form for my split itself. So enable syslog module, and what is the conditional split they listed under a gray list, and it's saying these two things should get exported. So the module and these two items should get exported to that directory, and that's kind of the magic. And then so if we were to go back to my settings file, and actually I do need to do lando drush CX, do the regular config export. All right, that's all good. And since I didn't delete this before the demo, it already found it, but it is the same. So now, if I go to back here, set this to dev. Now, one of the things, the gotchas, is you always need to clear cache after you make a change to this environment detection. Otherwise, Drupal will get really confused, and you will too. So we'll do a clear cache here, and what's going to happen is when I reload the page here, we're going to see that toolbar is going to change from red back to green, so I know that I'm on my dev, and we can see that the dev split that I set up is now active. And if we look at that, we just see that I've got complete split. So we got the database logging turned on, I've got the Devel module turned on, and then I have the same system logging and system performance in there too. And now, when I do lando drush config import, we will see syslog get turned off, we'll see Devel turned on, we'll see database logging turned on, just because it's taking those items from that config split and impacting them into the system. So we should see it install dblog, install Devel, uninstall syslog, updating system performance, and the caching may have been the same. So yeah, that's config management across environments. So any questions? Did I throw too much at you? Yeah.
Do you know if Acquia has default settings for like enterprise?
Default.
Or to config split? 'Cause I know it's there. I've never messed with it.
Yeah. Well, these are just contrib modules you would add to your site. I don't know if like some of their distributions have it out of the box. If maybe that's what you're looking for.
Well, like enterprise has dev stage and interacting different. So it must
Yeah.
already be turned on there, right?
Yeah, it could be, or you have some different settings that aren't managed in config that you've changed. So yeah.
Something just clicked with my HT access file got rewritten.
Uh huh.
And I know why.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That would do it.
The config split export is only once you update the exports. The configuration that is in the export is not necessarily doing every time you do a drush config export.
Right. I think the question was you would only do the config split export if you make changes to your splits. It doesn't have to be like every time you do a config export for the site. Let's say you added a content type, you don't have to do that every time. Just only if you make changes to that split. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.